Welcome back to another short story. Today we're going through the famous short novel written in 1961 by Kurt Vonnegut. Harrison Bergeron. The year was 2081, and everyone was finally equal. They were not only equal before God and the law, they were equal in every conceivable way. No one was smarter than anyone else. No one was better looking than anyone else. No one was stronger or quicker than anyone else. This equality was enforced by the 211th, 212th, and 213th Amendments to the Constitution, and maintained by the vigilant efforts of the United States Handicapper General. Of course, equality came at a price. Those who were above average in any way were burdened with handicaps to ensure they couldn't take unfair advantage of their natural talents. Smart individuals were required to wear mental handicap radios in their ears, designed to emit sharp noises to disrupt their thoughts. The beautiful had to wear masks or other disfiguring devices. The strong or graceful were weighed down with bags of birdshot. This was the law, and it was strictly enforced. George and Hazel Bergeron sat in their living room watching television. George had a mental handicap radio installed in his ear, as he was above average intelligence. Hazel, perfectly average in every way, required no handicaps. "That was a real pretty dance they just did," said Hazel, referring to the ballerinas on the screen. "Huh," George replied. He tried to think about the dancers, but his thoughts were interrupted by a loud, blaring sound from his radio. Hazel winced sympathetically. "That one was a doozy, wasn't it?" George nodded, his face tense with discomfort. "It sure was." Hazel's kind, vacant smile returned. "You should lie down and rest your handicap bag on the sofa," she suggested. "I don't mind it," George said. "I don't notice it anymore. It's just a part of me." Hazel frowned. "If I was handicapper general, you know what I'd do? I'd have chimes on Sunday, just to let people relax a little." George shook his head. If people started relaxing, they'd start thinking. And thinking, they both knew, was dangerous. The television program was suddenly interrupted by a news bulletin. Hazel clapped her hands in excitement. "Something real exciting must have happened," she said. On the screen, a nervous announcer appeared. He fumbled with his words, clearly unaccustomed to public speaking. His handicap impeded him further, his speech punctuated by sudden gasps and pauses, as though someone were squeezing his lungs. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer finally managed, "we interrupt this program to bring you an important bulletin." He paused, visibly straining to speak clearly. After several moments of struggle, he gave up and handed the announcement to one of the ballerinas. The ballerina, who had an unsteady voice and an ill-fitting mask, read the news with trembling hands. "Harrison Bergeron, age 14, has escaped from jail where he was held on suspicion of plotting to overthrow the government. He is a genius and an athlete, is under-handicapped, and is considered extremely dangerous." George and Hazel's jaws dropped in unison. Hazel whispered, "That's your son, isn't it, George?" George, struggling to process the news through the cacophony of his mental handicap, could only nod. The ballerina continued, "Harrison Bergeron is 7 feet tall and possesses strength and intelligence that cannot be contained by conventional means. He wears a vast array of handicaps, including scrap metal weights and a rubber ball nose. He has been declared a threat to society." As the ballerina finished, the screen abruptly flickered, and a new figure burst into view. Harrison Bergeron had entered the studio. Harrison was impossible to ignore. His immense size made the studio appear tiny by comparison, and the handicaps meant to subdue him only emphasized his power. The chains draped across his body clinked loudly as he moved, and the massive weights seemed to have no effect on his commanding presence. He wore a grotesque mask that failed to conceal his striking features, and headphones meant to dull his superior hearing. "I am the Emperor!" Harrison bellowed, his voice echoing through the room. "Do you hear? I am the greatest man who has ever lived." The crowd in the studio cowered in fear, their knees trembling. Harrison tore off his handicaps with ease, flinging them aside like trivial ornaments. The metal chains shattered as if made of glass, and the weights crashed to the ground with thunderous booms. Harrison turned to the camera, his expression fierce. I have come to free you from your chains, he declared. I am your new ruler. Watch me and see what humanity is capable of when it is unbound. He extended his hand to the ballerinas, commanding, Who among you will be my empress? There was a moment of hesitation before one of the ballerinas, smaller and frailer than the rest, stepped forward. Her movements were hesitant but deliberate, her mask trembling in her hands. Harrison approached her and gently removed her mask, revealing a face of extraordinary beauty. Now, let us show them what we can do, he said, his voice softening as he gazed at her. Harrison and the ballerina stood together in defiance of the laws that had oppressed them their entire lives. They began to dance. The television studio transformed into a stage for their rebellion. Freed from their burdens, they leapt and twirled with a grace that defied the limits of human potential. Their movements were a testament to the power of individuality and the beauty of unrestrained talent. As they ascended higher and higher, their dance seemed to transcend the confines of the studio. It was as though gravity itself had been conquered by their will. For a brief, glorious moment, they embodied the limitless potential of humanity. But their triumph was short-lived. Diana Moon Glampers, the handicapper general, stormed into the studio armed with a shotgun. Without hesitation, she raised the weapon and fired twice. Harrison and the ballerina collapsed to the floor. Their rebellion ended in an instant. The studio fell silent. The weight of conformity reasserted itself, crushing the brief flicker of hope. Hazel, still watching from home, turned to George, who had missed most of the events due to the interruptions of his mental handicap. Tears streamed down her face, but her expression remained oddly serene. "Something sad just happened," she said. George looked at her, puzzled. "What was it?" Hazel shook her head. "I forget," she said, wiping her tears. "It's probably best not to think about it." George nodded in agreement. A sharp noise from his mental handicap erased any lingering thoughts, and so the world returned to its state of perfect equality. In the aftermath of Harrison's dramatic rebellion, the government swiftly ensured that no trace of his actions would remain in public consciousness. The news coverage was censored, the broadcast was cut off before the public could fully grasp what had happened, and Harrison's name was scrubbed from official records. Those who had witnessed the event, including George and Hazel, were encouraged, whether through suggestion or the relentless interruptions of their handicaps, to forget entirely. But in the quiet corners of the nation, whispers persisted. Some spoke of the giant who tore away his chains, of the ballerina who danced as though the earth itself could not hold her. These whispers, fleeting and fragile, hinted at something that society had buried deep: the possibility of a world unbound by the constraints of mediocrity. For George and Hazel, however, life carried on as it always had. The days blurred together in a haze of television programs, interrupted thoughts, and placid conversations. One evening, George returned from work, visibly exhausted. His handicap bag seemed heavier than usual, and his face was lined with the strain of enduring the constant barrage of noises from his mental handicap radio. Hazel, seated on the couch, greeted him with her usual cheerful smile. "How was your day?" she asked. "Same as always," George replied, sinking into his chair. His voice carried a weariness that Hazel didn't notice. The television flickered on, filling the room with the glow of yet another mindless program. George watched absently, his thoughts wandering. For a brief moment, he felt a pang of unease, as though he were trying to recall something important, something that lingered just beyond his reach. A shrill noise erupted from his handicap radio, shattering the thought before it could take form. He winced, gripping the armrest of his chair. Hazel looked at him with concern. "That one sounded rough," she said. "Yeah," George muttered. He rubbed his temples, trying to soothe the lingering ache. "Sometimes I wonder," Hazel began, her voice trailing off as she struggled to find the words. "I mean, it's good that everyone's equal, right? But do you think maybe we could be just a little bit less equal? Just for a little while?" George frowned, the question gnawing at him. But before he could answer, another blast from his radio silenced the thought. Hazel, unaware of the interruption, continued. "I mean, if you could think without all those noises, maybe you could come up with some really good ideas. Or if those dancers didn't have to wear all that stuff, maybe they'd be even prettier. George shook his head. That's dangerous thinking, Hazel. You don't want to go down that road. I guess not, Hazel said, her smile returning. I wouldn't want to make anyone feel bad. The conversation drifted into silence and the television continued its endless stream of meaningless images. As the days turned into weeks, George began to notice faint echoes of the unease that had plagued him since Harrison's rebellion. It was never a fully formed thought, always interrupted before it could bloom, but it lingered, like a shadow cast by something unseen. At times he caught glimpses of it in his dreams. He would see a towering figure unbound and triumphant, and feel a surge of something he couldn't name. But the dreams always ended the same way, with the deafening sound of a shotgun blast and the feeling of being dragged back into the gray, unchanging world he knew. Hazel, too, began to experience fleeting moments of doubt. She would catch herself staring at the television, wondering why the programs all felt the same. Or she would hum a tune she didn't recognize, a melody that seemed to come from nowhere and feel an inexplicable sadness. But these moments were fleeting, and the weight of conformity always pulled them back. Elsewhere, in the offices of the Handicapper General, Diana Moonglampers reviewed reports from her agents. Harrison Bergeron's rebellion had been contained, but she knew that the fight to maintain equality was never truly over. Rebellions begin with ideas, she muttered to herself, and ideas must be stamped out before they take root. Her agents worked tirelessly, monitoring citizens for signs of dissent. They ensured that no one could rise above the rest, no matter how fleetingly. The handicaps became heavier, the penalties for non-compliance harsher. But even Diana, in her unyielding quest for order, could not extinguish the spark entirely. The whispers of rebellion refused to die. In small, secret gatherings, people shared fragments of what they remembered about Harrison Bergeron. They spoke of his defiance, his towering figure, and the grace of his final dance. Though the details were often muddled or incomplete, the core of his story persisted, a vision of humanity unshackled. In one such gathering, a young woman named Clara sat in silence as others recounted their hazy memories of Harrison. She had been a child when the event occurred, and while she couldn't recall watching it herself, she felt an inexplicable connection to the tale. What if we could be more than this? She asked, her voice trembling with uncertainty. The others exchanged uneasy glances. That's dangerous talk, an older man replied, his voice low. They'll come for you if they hear you thinking like that. Clara hesitated, but the words seemed to pour out of her despite herself. But what if Harrison was right? What if we're not meant to live like this? What if we're supposed to be different? The group fell silent. The idea hung in the air, heavy with both possibility and fear. Back in their home, George and Hazel's lives continued in their familiar rhythm. The television was their constant companion, a source of noise and distraction that filled the silence. One evening, as Hazel hummed softly to herself, George turned to her with a rare look of curiosity. "What's that tune you're humming?" he asked. Hazel paused, her brow furrowing. "I don't know," she admitted. "It just popped into my head." George frowned. "It sounds familiar." They sat in silence for a moment, the faint melody lingering in the air. But before the thought could take shape, George winced as his mental handicap emitted another piercing noise. Hazel reached out to touch his hand. "You okay?" "Yeah," George replied, his voice tinged with frustration. "I just wish... I don't know." Hazel tilted her head, studying him. "Wish what?" George shook his head, unable to articulate the vague yearning that had taken hold of him. "Never mind," he said. "It's not important." But the feeling lingered, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. Elsewhere, Clara's quiet defiance began to grow. She found herself drawn to the fragmented memories of Harrison Bergeron, piecing together a narrative that the government had tried to erase. She started writing her thoughts in a small, hidden journal, each entry a declaration of her belief in something greater than the world she knew. "We are not meant to be the same," she wrote. "We are meant to be extraordinary in our own ways." Her actions did not go unnoticed. The handicapper general's surveillance network was vast and unrelenting, and Clara's growing sense of rebellion soon caught their attention. One night, as she sat by the dim light of a candle, scribbling furiously in her journal, she heard a loud knock at her door. Her heart sank as she realized what was happening. The door burst open and two agents stormed in. "Clara Evans, you are under arrest for subversive activities," one of them announced. Clara stood her ground, clutching her journal to her chest. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said, her voice steady. "You've been thinking dangerous thoughts," the agent replied. "And that's more than enough." As Clara was taken away, the faint echoes of her defiance rippled through the community. Her arrest served as both a warning and a rallying cry, a reminder of the cost of rebellion and the power of an idea. George and Hazel, like so many others, remained oblivious to these events. Their lives were carefully insulated from such disruptions, their thoughts dulled by the constant barrage of handicaps and distractions. But deep within George's mind, buried beneath the relentless noise, a seed of doubt had taken root. He couldn't name it, couldn't fully grasp it, but it was there. A faint, persistent whisper that refused to be silenced. The whispers of rebellion grew into murmurs, spreading quietly among those who dared to question the world they lived in. Clara's arrest became a cautionary tale, but it also ignited a sense of unease that could not be ignored. Even among the most obedient citizens, there was a growing awareness that something was missing, something vital and human. For George, the unease manifested in small, subtle ways. He began to notice the weight of his handicap bag more acutely, the constant noise in his ears more grating. It wasn't just physical discomfort. It was a gnawing sense that his burdens were keeping him from something he couldn't name. One evening, as he sat in his chair watching television, he turned to Hazel with a rare look of determination. "Do you ever wonder why things are the way they are?" he asked. Hazel blinked, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if things could be different?" George said, his voice hesitant but insistent. Hazel frowned, her expression thoughtful. "I don't know," she said slowly. "I guess I've never thought about it." George nodded, as though he expected that answer. "Yeah," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Me neither." But the seed of doubt continued to grow. In another part of the country, Clara sat in a sterile interrogation room, her hands bound and her journal confiscated. Diana Moon Glampers herself stood across from her, cold and unyielding. "You've been thinking dangerous thoughts," Diana said, her voice sharp. "Do you understand what that means?" Clara met her gaze without flinching. "It means I'm still human," she replied. Diana's expression darkened. "It means you're a threat," she said, "to equality, to order, to everything we've built." "Equality isn't freedom," Clara said, her voice rising. "It's a cage, and you know it." Diana slammed her fist on the table, her composure cracking. "Enough," she snapped. "You will be reconditioned, and this will end here." But even as Clara was dragged away, the fire in her eyes remained. The government's efforts to suppress dissent grew more aggressive. Surveillance intensified, handicaps became more oppressive, and punishments for noncompliance more severe. Yet the whispers persisted, carried by those who refused to forget. George, though unaware of these larger movements, found himself increasingly restless. The fragmented memories of Harrison Bergeron's rebellion, buried deep in his subconscious, began to surface in dreams. He saw flashes of a towering figure breaking free from his chains, a dance that defied gravity, a moment of pure, unrestrained humanity. One night, he woke with a start, the image of Harrison still vivid in his mind. He turned to Hazel, who was sleeping peacefully beside him, and felt a pang of something he couldn't name. Longing, perhaps, or regret. He didn't know what it meant, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it was important. Clara's resistance did not go unnoticed. Though she was isolated and silenced, her words and actions had already taken root in the minds of others. Small acts of defiance began to emerge. A dancer who refused to wear her mask, a writer who hid forbidden ideas in plain sight, a citizen who dared to question the weight of his handicaps. These acts were often swiftly punished, but they carried a quiet power. They reminded people of what had been lost and what could still be reclaimed. George, in his quiet way, became part of this silent rebellion. He didn't speak out or act openly, but he began to think, truly think, for the first time in years. And though his thoughts were constantly interrupted by the blaring noise of his handicap radio, they always returned, persistent and unyielding. The government's grip remained strong, but cracks were beginning to show. The weight of conformity, once absolute, now seemed fragile in the face of a growing awareness. In their living room, George and Hazel continued their routine, unaware of the larger movements at play. Yet even in their small, insulated world, the spark of something greater flickered. One evening, as they watched television, a brief, unfiltered broadcast slipped through the cracks of the system. It was only a few seconds long, a blurry image of Harrison Bergeron, his voice echoing through the static. "I am the Emperor," he declared. "I am what you could be." The image vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the familiar, mindless programming. George and Hazel stared at the screen in stunned silence. For a moment, the room felt different, as though something profound had passed through it. "What was that?" Hazel asked, her voice trembling. George shook his head, his thoughts racing. "I don't know," he said. But deep down, he felt the stirrings of a memory, a truth he couldn't yet grasp.